Welcome everyone for the Teach for the Bay Part 3. We are the ones we have been waiting for. This workshop is 0 to 3, the growing brain, understanding behavior. And I know this is a workshop you've all been waiting for. Your presenters today are Martina Ibisagawa, ED, and Angela Bever.
Welcome everyone. So let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about and discussing the various areas of the brain and how they influence behavior. This curriculum is created by 0 to 3, which is to support early childhood professionals and how to understand brain development from birth to 5, and to understand how brain development impacts development as well as how it impacts behavior. So previous units have talked about cognitive development, social emotional development, as well as language development, as well as factors of the brain, as well as different parts of the brain. But today we're going to focus in on behavior. So let's get started. To begin, we're going to go over the objectives for today. And those include being able to understand a basic anatomy of the brain, being able to understand the connections between the various areas of the brain and how these connect and are expressed through behavior, understand the key factors that influence behavior, and understand the root causes of challenging behavior and the effective strategies for helping children with these difficulties. And I'm just going to change my view so I can see my whole screen. Okay, there we go. Alrighty, so to begin, we're going to think about what triggers us. So somebody wants captioned. Let me do that for you. Let's see if I can get captions. Can you do captions? Oh, here we go. There we go. Okay, so to begin with, we're going to talk about what triggers us when we're thinking about working with young children. And I'm going to give you a scenario, and I'd like you to close your eyes for this scenario. So close your eyes and think about this statement as I read it to you. So a child, you're working with a group of 2 to 3-year-olds, and one of the children spits on you. What is your gut reaction? How do you feel? And you can chat right in the chat. So I see something in the chat. Shocked. Okay, so if you're angry. Yes, these are all different ways that we can feel. Disconnect. Grossed out, upset. Great, curious, confused, surprised. Okay, let's go a little bit further and think about how we are feeling in our mind and body. So think about that whole interaction. How are you feeling in your mind and in your body? So let's read some more. Rejected. Yes. Again, how are you feeling in your mind and in your body? Shocked, puzzled, germy. Yeah. Yeah, these are all different things that we could be feeling. And then what would you say or do next? What would you say to the child or do next? What would you do next? So Sophia says it would depend it was purposely or an accident. Yeah. What would you do next? How are you feeling right now? You might ask the child how they're feeling. What else would you do? Wipe my face. Yes. Ask the child why they did that.
Dude, I've been knowing. I've been knowing.
I'd ask if everything is okay with them, or if something has happened to the child to do that. Don't do that. It's disrespectful. Is this something you need? Ask the child why they did that, why he or she did that. These are all really good suggestions. And so as we're thinking about that, let's think about what if we had an opportunity to freeze time for about 5 minutes to think about how we're going to respond. How might we respond differently? So what could we do differently if we had time to freeze, not have a gut reaction or a gut response? What might we do if we were able to freeze time? Elizabeth says they can't say why they did it. Try to find their emotion. So it's important for us to understand that our responses to challenging behavior are affected by what is going on in our own brains and in our own bodies. And so we can't adjust, right, depending on how we're responding. And Dan Siegel said, when we're really aroused, we flip our lids, meaning that we don't access that frontal cortex of our brain, that we focus on predominantly on our lower parts of our brain to engage our children that we're working with, or maybe for our parents to engage the young ones that we have. And so it's really important that we understand that in order for us to support young children, we also have to be curious about what's going on for ourselves. And we'll be talking a little bit later about how to cope and how to calm ourselves when things happen. There's something in the chat. It says, we wouldn't react so impulsively and assess the situation in a more reasonable way. That's so right. That's right, Mara. Thank you. Okay, let's keep going. So we're going to do some brain anatomy first before we jump into how it connects to behavior. And one of the things is that we're going to cover the basic parts of the brain. The brain can be divided into regions and subregions. And the first, we have the cerebral cortex over here. Then we have the brainstem, which is this portion over here. And then we have the limbic system, which is what we're going to focus on a lot. And I'm just going to use my laser to kind of help us with pointing today. One of the things with the brainstem is that it includes the midbrain and the hindbrain. So it has two portions of the brain. And some of the things that we covered in other lectures or other presentations on the brain was that the brain develops from bottom to top. So it develops with the brainstem area, and it goes all the way up to the top, with the frontal cortex being the last part of the brain to develop. And so let's keep going. So the hindbrain is this portion on the bottom part of the brain. It connects to the spinal cord as well as to the brain itself. And so it sends and controls reflexes and involuntary processes. It's responsible for our fight, flight, and freeze response. It also is responsible for sending messages from our lungs and heart. And so for children who have had toxic stress for prolonged periods of time and the architecture of the brains have changed, this portion of the brain can be affected. And so when you see a child throwing things in a classroom or acting up, sometimes it's because of toxic stress and trauma. And it's because they're accessing this lower portion of their brain. They're accessing the mid and hindbrain portions of their brain, which has to do with their heart rate and their breathing. And so one of the things that happens with that is that the children are so anxious, and they're so because of the cortisol levels that have gone through their brain, and so upset that they have difficult time accessing the frontal cortex, which has to do with planning and thinking. One of the things that's really important is the limbic system. This has to do with the area that's beneath the cerebrum, and it has to do with, it really helps us with our emotions and also the many higher functions of our mental abilities. It matures over time, and the areas of the limbic system that are really important are the hypothalamus, which has to do with mood, and we'll be talking a little bit about that. The amygdala, which has to do with emotions, the brainstem, the hippocampus, which has to do with memories. And again, I keep bringing this back to bringing it back because one of the things in my work as a clinician and as a consultant for the California Inclusion Behavior Network, one of the things I've seen in classrooms is that children have a hard time with accessing their frontal cortex, and they spend a lot of time in this limbic system area of their brains. And teachers a lot of times treat the children as though they're morally bad or they're morally difficult, rather than realizing that there's some structure of their brain that has happened, as well as that maybe there's some sensory processing issues that are happening that it's causing them to have challenges. And so it's really important that we understand the complexities of these portions of the brain and what each of these portions attribute to behavior. So the hypothalamus, which is this portion right here, this has to do with controls body temperature, thirst, hunger, our sleep-wake cycle, and our mood. It's also tied to the thresholds, the sensory thresholds that we have with our temperament, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit. And so it's really important that, again, this area of the brain is developing well. The amygdala is this little shape, this little corn shape item right here, and it's responsible for analyzing and perceiving and expressing emotion. It undergoes significant structure and functional development across infancy and early childhood. One of the things with the amygdala is that if, for example, you see a charging dog coming towards you, you might get afraid and you might be curious as to what's happening. It's your amygdala that alerts you and gets you excited and tells you to run or to fight back, although I don't think it's good to fight back a dog. So it's this area of your brain that helps you to get excited. The other thing as well about the amygdala is that it also includes emotions such as sadness, anger, joy, all of the different emotions that you might think of are coming from the amygdala. And then the hippocampus is very curious because it has to do with long-term memories, and it's shaped like a seahorse. It also has to do with memories of location. And so one of the things that's really important about this portion of the brain is that if you, for example, are in the parking structure and you're looking for your car, it's your hippocampus that's going to help you remember where your car is at. Or for a baby, it's the hippocampus that's going to remember what a mother's or father's face looks like based on the memories that they've gathered from collecting images over time. The other thing about the hippocampus is that it develops throughout the lifespan. And so it's really important to understand that it's not just something that develops in early childhood, but it continues to develop throughout the life. And then we come to the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex, what is really crucial about this is that it has the 4 different lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. And we'll be diving in a little bit deeper about that. Again, like I mentioned, the brain develops from the bottom of the brain, so from the brainstem all the way to the top, to the frontal cortex. So this is the last area of the brain to develop. This part of the brain has to do with advanced activities such as planning and decision-making. And the other thing is that this area of the brain is not fully developed until the mid-20s. And so you want to think about that when we're thinking about having children access their frontal lobe to plan and make decisions about different things in the classroom. We want to make sure that we're not giving them too much of a challenge. And so this could come up when we arrange our classrooms, the environments in the classroom. If the classroom is too organized in a way that the child has to really think about motor planning or has to think about moving their body through negotiating their body through the room, plus keeping their hands to themselves, plus not running into their peers, that can be really challenging. And so it's really important that we set up our classrooms in a way that allows for this area of the brain to still continue developing in the early years. Any questions so far? I'll stop and pause and just ask for any questions so far. Okay, we'll keep any in the chat. Okay, we'll keep going. Oh, there's one in the chat.
It says hello.
Oh, it's a hello. Hi, Sophie. Hello. Okay, let's keep going. The frontal lobe is the first lobe. So remember, as I mentioned before, that the cerebrum is divided into 4 different lobes, which include the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. And so the frontal lobe has to do with decision-making, critical thinking, personality, and planning. So if you think about the child and who they are, a lot of this is going to be coming in the frontal lobe, and this is going to be coming in later on in the early childhood period. If you're thinking about their development and their temperament and who they are, it's going to be coming through at that point. Do we have a question in the chat?
The question is, can you please give us a link to the PowerPoint presentation?
You'll have access to the recording, and so you can have access to the recording and you'll have all of the different slides through that. We're also going to be giving away the participant manual to the first 20 participants to email us. So you'll be able to get the whole manual for this unit if you mail. I was able to purchase 20 copies for the participants. The next section of the brain is the parietal lobe. And this section of the brain is really important because it has to do with sensory processing. And so this lets the child know that, oh, don't go near the heater in the classroom. It's too hot. You might get burnt. Or maybe the snow, if they're playing in snow, if they're in a cold climate, that the snow is cold. So this is where the sensory information gets processed as well. The other thing that's important is the temporal lobe. This is where we have hearing and selective listening, understanding speech, and making sense of all different sounds. And this is based on the sensory processing of our auditory processing from our ears. And so one of the things that's really important is that children can have auditory processing challenges, as well as we've been talking a little bit about the occipital lobe, which processes the vision. They can have vision processing challenges. All of these different challenges can affect how behavior is communicated in the classroom or at home. And do we have more comments in the chat?
Just a request for the email.
Oh, we'll give that out at the end. So as I mentioned, the occipital lobe has to do with visual information. So being able to process visual information. So again, the child who is visually stimulated in the classroom. So a lot of times as teachers, we like to decorate our classrooms and put things hanging from the ceilings and things like that. And that may have challenges on children based on how their brains are processing that information, not so much their sight, not so much their vision, what they can see, but how that information gets processed. And so again, we want to be thinking about that when we're developing our environments. And we're going to be talking about how environment affects behavior a little bit later. So we have the whole brain. We've gone through the different parts, and I'll just highlight them again. We've gone through the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, the frontal lobe, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and the limbic system, and the brainstem. So now what I'd like you to do is, Angela's going to drop in the chat for you. We're going to do an activity. And you're going to take the brain that you see here and the handout 6.1, which has behavior, skills, and the brain worksheet. And what you're going to do is you're going to look at the different behaviors that you see and try to identify what area of the brain is being affected by that behavior. And it's done by age group. So there's birth to 9 months, 9 to 18 months, 18 to 36 months, and 36 to 60 months. And we're going to do this in a small group, in a discussion group. And so Angela's going to break us into small groups, and I'll come through the groups if possible. And just go through the books, and you can decide on if you want to just do 2 of the developmental levels, or if you want to do all 4, depending on if you can capture an understanding of the different parts of the brain for the behaviors for within the 8 minutes. So why don't we go ahead and break into groups. And were you able to drop it in?
Oh, sorry. Did you want me to drop that in the chat first before we break into groups? All right. So I'm sorry. I'm on a different computer today.
No worries.
Just a moment.
And you can drop in the glossary too, so they have the glossary to help them.
For some reason, I'm not getting access to what we need. So I'm sorry for the delay.
Well, Angela is working on that. We can start by looking at the first one. So the first one is a strong heartbeat. We have a birth to 9-month-old child who has a strong heartbeat. What area of the brain do you think might be effective? And you can use the chat, or you can say it out loud. Well, what area of the brain do you think would be affected by a strong heartbeat? Somebody has a post, let me see. The brainstem, excellent. Yeah, the brainstem. Okay, the next one is a child cries to indicate their wants and needs. What area of the brain do you think would that be affected by? So they're crying to indicate their wants and their needs. Oh, there we go. She got it in. Okay.
Right, I got them.
The amygdala. Yes, the amygdala and the hypothalamus. Excellent. Good. You guys are getting it. Good. And we'll do the last one together, and then we'll go into our groups. The last one is response to a familiar face. Oh, I'm giving you the answers. You're looking at the answers. No wonder you're getting. I'm giving you the one with the answers. Here we go. Response to a familiar face. What would be the? What do you think that would be? Remember the section that has to do with memory? Yes, the hippocampus. Wonderful. Okay, great. So let's go into our groups, and you guys can do the remaining 3.
All right,
We'll go in 5 minutes. Okay. So I know sometimes it's difficult being in groups, so we'll do these activities together. And so the next one would be a child from 19 to 18 months has difficulty separating has separation anxiety. Which area of the brain do you think might be affected for that particular child? You can use the chat to kind of help you with that as well. Yes, the amygdala. And what else do you think might be affected? The other part that would be effective is the hypothalamus as well. That's because the hypothalamus, remember, has to do with the different cycles, the mood, as well as having to do with realizing our different areas of the brain and how we're functioning with temperature and a variety of different things like that. Then the next one is points to common objects. So if a child is pointed to common objects, which area of the brain do you think that they're using for that?
That's the hippocampus, I think.
Yeah, okay, yes. And what else do you think? It would be the occipital lobe, because they have to see it and process it, right? They have to process what they just saw, right? So it'd be those two different things. That was excellent, very good. Okay, so the next one is 18 to 36 months. The child asserts independence. What area of the brain? Remember the areas for planning and thinking and problem solving. What area would that be?
That's the frontal, but you said that wasn't done developing until the 20s, right? Is it already developing at this age enough to do that?
Yes, it is. It's enough for it to be able to assert independence. So the frontal lobe continues to develop into the 20s, and so it's not fully developed in the sense that if you have a really significant problem that you have to solve, the child might have difficulty. So, for example, if the child is having to do some kind of worksheet in preschool, that will be harder for a child than for a child, for example, who is in maybe in elementary school. And then for a child who's in high school, for example, they may have difficulty processing and negotiating social interactions and having to problem solve those different interactions or interactions with their parents. If their parents ask them to do different things, having to negotiate what they want. And so that's that part of their brain that they have difficulty accessing. Does that make sense? Hello?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Yes. Okay, and then the next one is plays pretend with other children. What area of the brain would be affected by that? So being able to play pretend. The hippocampus for remembering, and the brainstem. So it really wouldn't be the brainstem in the sense, because the brainstem has to do with heart rate and temperature and things like that. But it would be the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe, and it would be the parietal lobe for processing sensory information, as well as the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe, because they see their friend and they process the different information that they see from their friend and the toys they're playing with, as well as the language that they're also taking in the language through the parietal lobe and being able to understand. Okay, the last one we'll do together is, this is a good one, shows empathy towards other children. A 36 to 60-month-old shows empathy towards other children. What area of the brain are they using?
Temporal and frontal?
Yes, exactly. Very good. So they're using the temporal lobe as well as the occipital lobe and the parietal lobes. They're using all of those different lobes because remember they have to engage emotionally with their peer. They have to understand what their peer is communicating and to sense what their peer is feeling and show with that. And then they also have to see their friend's face and negotiate those emotions and know that, oh, this is a sad face, this is a caring face, and then be able to show empathy. So you can see how the brain really shows affects behavior in young children. Okay, let's keep going. So all behavior has meaning. I remember when I was working with one child who had lots of difficulties with behavior in the classroom and just really needed a lot of one-on-one support. The child wasn't diagnosed, but one of the things that we had a consultant come in and really brought home to us was that the behavior has meaning and that we needed to figure out what the child was trying to communicate to us by their behavior. And so that was the first time several years ago that I heard behavior has meaning. And so that was really intriguing for me. And so one of the things that I've come to see as well is that behavior is expressed through our developmental age and stages. And so depending on the children's developmental levels, this will affect behavior. The temperament will affect behavior, as well as environmental factors. And we've been talking a little bit about environment already when I talked about the arranging of the classroom, that this can affect how children engage and how their behavior gets expressed, as well as their temperament, so how they respond. And we'll be diving into temperament a little bit more. So one of the things that's important that for us to be effective in responding to children regarding their behavior, we need to understand why the behavior is occurring. And so let's dive a little bit deeper into behavior. So development includes the abilities in all domains such as cognition, language, communication, social emotional development, and physical development. You may ask yourself, well, how do skills and abilities affect behavior? So one of the good examples is that for a child who has difficulty with communication, right, using their language, they're going to then use their hands to maybe hit, or maybe they're going to use their emotions, the amygdala, to cry to get what they want. They're going to revert back to some of the things that they had before they had the language. And so it's really important for us to be aware of that when we're working with children. It's also important for us to understand that children under the age of 3 are driven by emotions, not logic. They want and need some sense of control over the world, and they have very little self-control. In children who are struggling, who are older, you can also see this, that they also are struggling to want to have control over the world. This is especially for children who have not learned to self-soothe and self-regulate themselves. And so one of the things that, one of the items, for example, that we have used, I'm just looking at the magazine right now from Beyond Play, which has a lot of sensory processing apparatus in it, but giving children a squeeze, a sensory pillow for them to squeeze, or a sensory mat for them to sit on, or a sensory ball, or something to rock on. All of these different things will really help to center that system so that they're able to control their heart rates and their breathing, so that they feel a sense of control internally. Because I'm not talking more about older children now, as opposed to younger children who are 3-year-olds. Usually 3-year-olds and younger, we hold them, right? We comfort them. So this is how they learn to integrate self-soothing techniques by what they receive from us and what they take on from us. But when we don't give them this, then they start to have difficulties later on. So if we dive deeper, I have an example here of a child. This is a 2-year-old who refuses to cooperate with cleanup. It may be a part due to the fact that she has she is asserting a newfound independence. She knows that she has her own thoughts and ideas that are separate from what the others are thinking and feeling. Asserting her independence, letting the teachers know that she doesn't want to put the toy away, even though they want her to put the toy away, is acceptable behavior for a child who's 2. This behavior, however, is not acceptable for a child, for example, who is 6, because we know that they have the language and they should have the language and they should have the social emotional capacities to regulate themselves, as well as to negotiate, as well as to comprehend understanding, as well as to be able to take on the perspective of somebody else. We know that 2-year-olds are going through autonomy, as well as going through a lot of ego support learning. And so it's really important for us to understand that when we're supporting children who are older, who are not exhibiting their behaviors according to the development, that we ask ourselves why, and that we go back to our infant learning foundations, our preschool learning foundations, to kind of help us think about how we can support them. So this is just one example of a 2-year-old, how it's appropriate for them to have autonomy and say no, but it's not appropriate for a 6-year-old. The other thing that's important is self-regulation and self-control. This has to do with attention, emotion, and thinking behavior. The other thing is executive function, and I have an example here for executive function. And before I do that, I wanted to ask, what does self-control look like to you? And you can just jot that in the chat. What do you think self-control looks like to you?
Resisting urges.
Okay, resisting urges, okay. Delayed demand for immediate gratification. Staying calm. Being able to control my emotions, patience, knowing what to do or not to do. These are all great examples. Let's take a look at an example of a young one. They're doing an art project at school. So the first part is that they have to pay attention and not get distracted by what others are doing in the classroom. This would be sustained attention. Next, they need to remember the steps for the project. This would be the working memory aspect of executive function. Then they need to control themselves because they want the glue too, and their children and the other person has the glue, so they have to wait for the glue. This is an inhibitory control. And then they have to also manage their frustration because they can't get the glue to squeeze out of the bottle. And so they decide to use both hands to squeeze. And this is cognitive flexibility. And so you can see here that the child is using a typical example of an art experiment or an art project that they're doing in the classroom, that if the child doesn't have sustained attention or working memory or inhibitory control or cognitive flexibility, they have a lot of difficult times being able to carry out the activity in a fashionable way. And what else is in the chat?
Mouth clenching and thinking what to do correctly.
Okay.
Right
These are
and wrong.
some examples. Okay. So these are just some examples of what self-control would look like to us. And these are what executive function would look like in a child who's doing an art project. Does anyone want to take a stab at what a project a child might be doing in class and apply sustained attention, working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility, what that might look like?
Some type of role playing, like playing house.
Okay, a role play. Yeah, that's
But
really
they-
good. Uh-huh.
It's like they're cooking dinner, pretend they have to share tools and dishes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they have to have attention to be able to carry out the activity. They have to be able to have inhibitory control to not just grab the cake or whatever it is that they're making from their friend. And they have to have the cognitive flexibility to manipulate the apparatus. Great, that was a great example. Thank you. So The next portion of the brain that's really important is the anterior cingulate. And this portion of the brain, which is right here, and let me use my pointer again, which is right here, is basically allows for messages to go from the limbic system to the prefrontal cortex. And this allows for there to be, for the brain to regulate both cognitive and emotional processes for the brain and for the child. Control over impulses starts around 3 years old, but is often inconsistent. So you can see that a 6-year-old may have difficulty controlling their impulses, as well as maybe a 5-year-old. And so this area of the brain continues to develop. And so we have to make sure that we're aware of that. The other thing that's important that affects behavior is temperament. And one of the things about temperament is that it's brain-based, and it's part of our biological makeup. And so one of the questions they ask is, can temperament be affected by our environment? Yes, it can, because it is brain-based. And so just as the brain architecture of the brain can be affected by the experience, so can our temperament. And so one of the things with temperament is that's really important for us to understand is that children express themselves in a variety of different ways. And one of those is through their activity level, their distractibility, their intensity, their regularity, the sensory threshold, their approach and withdrawal, their adaptability, their persistence, and their mood. So what does that all mean? These are the different traits. A lot of times we just focus on are they fussy? Are they easy and flexible? Are they slow to warm up? But one of the things that temperament research has gone into is found the 9 different traits that help us to think about temperament in a more involved way. An activity level basically means are the children really active? So is the child in your classroom really active, or are they really still? Are they able to hold themselves still and they're calm? Are they easily distracted? Does things easily distract them, or are they easily focused? Are they really intense, meaning they get upset really easy and they get really loud? Or are they calm and neutral? Regularity has to do with elimination and sleep, as well as wake cycles. And so are they regular in their elimination? This can be a real problem for some families that I've worked with, when the child is not regular, for example, in the elimination, and so they get backed up and they're not going to the bathroom. This can affect then the mood of the child. It can affect how the child processes different things. And so one of the things is that one of the programs I know that at Children's Hospital that we have that my coworkers used to work in is called Fussy Babies, where they work with babies who have a high, who are very intense, who are irregular, have really low thresholds, and are very have difficulty adapting to new situations. One of the things when you think about sensory threshold, this is often situated in the thalamus, and sensory threshold has to do with how much you can take before you get upset, or before you react. And so some of us have a high sensory threshold, we can take a lot, and some of us have a low sensory threshold. And one of the things about having a high sensory threshold versus a low sensory threshold as a teacher is that if you're working with a child who has a low sensory threshold, who gets hurt really easily, cries really easily, and you have a high sensory threshold, meaning it takes a lot for you to feel pain or to react, then it might be important for you to think about how you can respond more through your cognitive processes, where you're thinking about, I need to be active, I need to respond to the person, to the child, because I'm not perceiving that this is a challenge, but this child is perceiving that it's a challenge. And then approach and withdrawal. This means that the child is easy to approach to new things versus they withdraw from new things. So transitions, for example, for a child in this form of this temperament trait can be very difficult for them. If, for example, if they have a hard time approaching. Adaptability is how much they can adapt to new things. Persistence is how long they can persist with things. And their mood is do they have a negative mood or a positive mood? So one of the things that we talk about with the brain and temperament is that we look for a goodness effect, which is what I described a little bit earlier. But as I mentioned before, temperament is very much built in the brain. And so again, if you have the structures of the brain that are affected, temperament will also be affected. Also, temperament has to do with personality. So the personality of the child will also be formed by the brain and by the temperament of the child. And so it's really important to know that that's also important. And also experience is something that affects it as well. I talked a little bit about sensory thresholds, so I'm not going to spend too much time, but a good example that they give us here is that if the child is in a gym, for example, one child can be really responding well to all the activities, jumping on the beams and playing. However, another child can be overstimulated. And so one of the things that you might think about is giving the child sound canceling headphones to be able to support them so that they're able to access the environment, or maybe making an area in the gym that is just focused and simple so that they're not overloaded visually, so that occipital lobes are not overstimulated. So I've talked a lot about environment already in the classroom, but environment has an impact on behavior. One of the things that we talk about is the quality of early attachments. And so, is a child securely attached? Are they insecurely attached? What is the relationship like for the parents or the caregivers with the children? Circle of Security has now done a lot of research on teacher-child interactions as well. And so a lot of times we think about just the parent attachments, but we don't think about the teacher-child attachments. But those are also important for us to think about, especially if we're thinking about responsive caregiving. Poverty also has an effect on behavior. One of the things I try to say, though, is that I don't like to blanket and just say all poor children are going to act out. I don't think that's right to say that. I know that I've worked with lots of poor children who are well-rounded and behave well, but poverty can have a effect, and that's because the likelihood of you having access to toxic stress or having access to poor attachment due to other factors are things that can happen. Also, the parents' reactions to children's challenging behavior can also affect behavior. So the transactional process, which is basically, if you do this, I'll give you that. So we start to bribe children. Also alcohol exposure in utero, and then parental abuse or neglect. And these are all things that we've talked a little bit about in our earlier descriptions of brain development. We've talked about factors that affect brain development. The other thing that affects behavior is significant changes can result in behavioral changes. Changes in everyday routines and ongoing stress can also affect. So, for example, if we're teachers who like to change up our classrooms all the time, this can also have an effect on children. Or if we don't keep our routines going for young children, this can also have an effect as well. We'll come back to this activity a little bit later. We'll look at an example. I'm going to keep going just because we're coming close to time. But this is a great activity that will probably that you'll have if you get the 20 people that get the manual, and it just describes different behaviors, and then it helps teachers to think about development, temperament, and environment that might be affecting the behaviors of the child. The other thing that's important to know is that managing challenging behaviors is guided by recognizing that children are not bad on purpose. And so I really try to encourage teachers to not think about children from a moral point of view when they're thinking about behavior. A lot of times we want to think about, is a child good or bad? We like to give them goodie marks or stars, or sometimes you give them stickers. But these are not ways of coping with children's behaviors. If we think about children are trying to communicate to us and that their behavior has meaning, then we're more inclined to want to be responsive to them. The other thing is that feelings aren't the problem. It's what we do with our feelings that can become problematic. So we heard in the beginning, we talked about what triggered us, right? And so you could see how we all had our own feelings about the child spitting on us. And then after we had the 5 minutes to kind of think back about how we would react, we reacted differently. Also, caregivers help children handle strong emotions when they themselves are regulated, and they're also in control of themselves. And so let's take a look at this clip from Circle of Security. It's really short. It talks about being with, as well as getting and how shark music gets in the way of us being able to support children. So let's do that. If it will let me, let's see here.
Parents. Throughout history, we've struggled to get it right. We hope we won't pass on our emotional issues to our kids, and we swear we won't make the same mistakes our parents did. We all have great intentions, but something seems to get in the way. Let's look at what that might be. At Circle of Security Parenting, we believe that being emotionally available to our children and their needs is the key to doing our best as parents. We call emotional availability being with. It means teaching emotional intelligence by being with our children in all their feelings, like sadness, joy, anger, curiosity, pain, frustration, excitement, and so on. Being with children helps them understand, trust, and move on from feelings. And knowing someone is with them in their feelings helps children feel less overwhelmed and more secure. Decades of research backs this up. For parents, some of this comes easily, but other times our children express emotions that make us uncomfortable, so we pull away or try to overrule their feelings, which leaves them on their own. We do this because our children's feelings can trigger strong emotions in us. We think of it like this: our history during childhood of how core people responded to our different emotions creates the background music for how we experience our children's feelings. Let's look at this example. This girl and her father have been enjoying time together in the park, but suddenly aware of the time, Dad says, "We need to go." When the girl hears this, she starts crying and gets increasingly angry. All at once, the dad's background music changes. The background music that is playing for the father right now, we call shark music. As it turns out, the dad's own mother was uncomfortable with loud displays of emotion, and she didn't know how to handle them. So throughout his childhood, she repeatedly told her son it was pathetic to cry, and she never ever asked him about his feelings of sadness or anger. His ability to deal with his daughter's emotion now is greatly affected by the experience with his mother then. Shark music. We're rarely aware it's playing, but it's our past experiences telling us to be afraid of or uncomfortable with a feeling or need that is actually safe. When our sharp music limits our ability to respond to these feelings, our children learn to hide or feel ashamed of them. This is a problem because we're teaching our children to fear emotions that are actually both safe and essential in life. Most of us experience sharp music with one emotion or another, and it's different for everyone. But whenever it is triggered, our ability to respond to our children's needs is limited. The good news is, by simply calling it by name and reflecting on what our children need in the moment, we can turn down our sharp music. This is so important because if we can learn to manage our history of negative experiences and perceptions, we can respond to the truth of our child's current situation and be with them in it. Ultimately, this will help our children grow up with a better ability to understand and share more of the emotions they experience. There's no escaping it. Strong feelings are a challenge to manage as parents, but our children always benefit when we have an accurate response to what's happening, rather than reacting to the sharp music we're bringing into the relationship. Remember, there's no such thing as perfect parenting, and blame never helped anyone feel more secure. That includes blaming ourselves. But the more often we can identify our sharp music, the better off our children will be.
Okay. So that was just about how we can be affected by our own anxieties from the past of how we were raised. And so it blocks us from being able to be responsive to children. As you can see here in this picture, this child is being really responsive of this other. And if you can imagine a parent or a teacher being responsive of a child. And so we'll end with our final slide. With that, the key messages are that the various areas of the brain are involved in the young children's behavior. How behaviors get expressed is influenced by several key factors. Challenging behavior is in very young children can evoke strong emotions, and it's important to observe and try to understand the meaning of behavior and respond to it in a sensitive, supportive, and nurturing fashion. All right, thank you. Any questions for those who want to stay a little bit longer? I saw some comments in the chat. All righty.
As a reminder, for the first 20 participants who email me at abever@dvc.edu will receive the participant manual. And we did record this workshop. I will email it to the emails that I sent this invitation to, and you should also be able to find it on the Teach for the Bay website when it becomes available. And I see that Kathleen White has also put an evaluation form in the chat, so please also click on the link.
And also, if you want to give them the other thing I was thinking of, which I'm forgetting now, so I'll just keep quiet. Well, thank you so much, everyone.
What about the certificates for students who would
Yes,
like that?
that's what I was thinking of. The
Oh,
certificate.
okay.
You want to drop that in the chat?
I think I just put it in the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. I was like, oh, what did I forget?
And if there's anything else, you can email me. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.